This is the architecture of dependency: economic abuse, housing instability, the structural erosion of autonomy. A legally grounded analysis examining economic abuse, housing instability, coercive debt, financial dependency, Article 8 rights, A1 AP1 rights, Section 25 of the Marital Causes Act 1973, safeguarding failures and the structural erosion of autonomy within family court justice systems. This is the architecture of dependency, economic abuse, housing instability, and family court justice. So we're going to examine the economics of abuse, coercive debt, housing instability, your rights under Article 8, and your rights under Section 25 of the Marital Causes Act, your financial dependency and safeguarding failures within the modern family proceedings. This episode examines one of the least understood realities of coercive control, the structural erosion of autonomy through economics dependency. Domestic abuse is frequently discussed through physical harm, emotional harm, or isolated behavioral incidents. But coercive control frequently operates through long-term destabilization of independence itself. This may include financial depletion, housing insecurities, coerced debt, restricted autonomy, litigation exhaustion, and structural dependency reinforced through procedural systems over time. Now, the issue is not merely the economics of hardship. The issue is dependency architecture. So let's address what I call the economic harm as a structural control. The Domestic Abuse Act 2021 recognized coercive control or coercive abuse as a component of domestic abuse within the statute. So this was legally significantly acknowledged that coercive control frequently operates through financial restriction, deprivation of resources, economic surveillance, and dependency creation. So economic abuse may evolve through restriction or restricted access to funds, coerced liabilities, debt accumulation, litigation depletion, interference with employment, housing instability, or long-term erosion of financial and autonomy. The objective of coercive financial dynamics is often not simply control of money, but control of movement, stability, and independence itself. So housing as a human right issue. Housing instability is not merely an economic issue, it is increasingly a safeguarding and a human right issue under Article 8 ECHR. individuals possess rights concerning private life, family life, home, and personal stability. Similarly, Article 1, Protocol 1, A1P1 protects peaceful enjoyment of possessions, where coercive debt, procedural depletion, financial asymmetry, or litigation-related instability results in housing insecurity, displacement, or prolonged instability. The constitutional implications may become profound because the erosion of housing stability frequently triggers psychological destabilization, nervous system exhaustion, and participation impairment simultaneously. The Section 25 of the Marital Causes Act 1973 and the lived reality, Section 25 of the MCA itself requires courts to consider needs, resources, obligations, earnings, earning capacity, health, contributions, and overall fairness. However, many individuals experience a growing gap between statutory intention and lived outcome, particularly where coercive control existed, financial opacity existed, disclosure asymmetry existed, or participation impairment was affected during proceedings. The issue is not necessarily absence of legal principles. The issue is operational implementation under conditions of cumulative imbalance. Coercive debt and structural dependence. Coercive debt frequently extends far beyond the liabilities themselves. The debt may continue affecting the victim of domestic abuse's credit file, access to credit, access to housing, access to banking, participation, financial mobility, and long-term autonomy for years afterwards. SafeChain identifies this as continuity or a continued based dependence erosion, where financial harm continues producing vulnerability long after the original coercive environment or proceedings have ended. This creates prolonged instability in one's life, constrained mobility, and structural dependence cycles. Therefore, it's not only the autonomy that is affected, the procedural system dependence reproducing harm. So one of the most difficult parts in the constitution is the question is whether procedural systems may unintentionally reproduce the dependence structures itself, where litigation becomes prolonged, financial depletion and escalates, legal costs accumulate, credit deteriorates, housing becomes unstable, because every event has a knock-on effect. The procedural environment itself may contribute to the economic of vulnerability, restricted autonomy, and dependency in reproduction of the harm itself. This is especially significant where one party controls substantial resources while the opposing party experiences exhaustion, participation impairment, and financial destabilization. That is inequality of arms. The constitutional question is no longer simply whether systems recognize domestic abuse. The question now is whether systems recognize the long-term structural consequences of economic destabilization itself. Because where autonomy collapses, participation frequently collapses with it. Housing instability, credit erosion, financial exclusion, and prolonged procedural exhaustion are not isolated outcomes. They are interconnected, safeguarding realities that the courts fail to recognize. So, Safechain argues that safeguarding must include financial continuity, housing continuity, credit report protection, participation, sustainability, and autonomy restoration. Because safeguarding cannot remain meaningful where economic destabilization continues, reproducing vulnerability long-term after proceedings concluded. The objective is not dependency management. The objective is autonomy preservation. There's a difference. So, we cannot continue saying the family courts are letting children and families down when the solution exists. The future of safeguarding is not merely recognizing abuse. It is recognizing how systems may unintentionally reproduce dependency structures through fragmented procedural and financial environments, because coercive control frequently survives through instability, exhaustion, dependency, and structural erosion of one's autonomy itself. This is the architecture of dependency. This is Silence Screams Loud Strength, Unmasking Justice series. Unmasking Justice through Safechain. You have just listened to Unmasking of the System and its Process. We have examined the realities beneath the language of policy, procedure, and institutional assurance. We have looked at how harm allowed to continue when systems fail to connect. Evidence safeguarding, finance, housing, participation, procedure, and operational accountability within family court systems. This work is not theoretical, It is not abstract. It is not commentary. This is postgraduate safeguarding protocols and legal policy curriculum built through lived experience, constitutional analysis, statutory frameworks, and operational realities in modern day family proceedings. It is the difference between knowing what the process says and understanding how the harm happened. Self-chain exists because safeguarding cannot remain symbolic. Safeguarding must become operational, measurable, continuous, trauma-informed, legally coherent, and capable of protecting people across the system that affects their lives. To councils, local authorities, housing teams, and safeguarding departments. You see instability in the family setting. You see repeated patterns. You see people failing or falling between systems. SafeChain provides a framework for turning policy language into operational safeguarding practice. To the police force, coercive control, procedural abuse, and evidential erosion requires more than incident-based recognition. They require contextual understanding, accurate recording, and operational continuity. To the lawyers, barristers, legal professionals, and regulated practitioners, the question is no longer only whether procedure has been followed. The question is whether procedure has produced fairness, safeguarding participation, and preserved the integrity of justice. To HR, governance, risk, and institutional leaders, you cannot protect what your systems are not trained to recognize. SafeChain provides a framework for identifying complex harm, vulnerability, coercive behavior, and institutional risk before failure becomes embedded. The SafeChain seal of integrity is not a minimum standard. It is not a tick box badge. It is a safeguarding and operational integrity standard for organizations prepared to move beyond performative compliance. It represents evidence integrity, participation integrity, and safeguarding continuity, operational accountability, and real-world understanding of harm as it actually occurs. This is not simply training. It is a framework for institutional competence to bring SafeChain training, licensing, certification, or the seal of integrity into your organization. Visit safechain.org, the intelligence hub. Stop treating safeguarding as an afterthought. Build systems that recognize harm before collapse becomes inevitable. I'm Samantha. Thank you for listening.